A narrow strip of water on the other side of the planet may be messing with the price of your gasoline, your food, your heating bill, and maybe even the cost of living of Canada as a whole. Sounds like exaggeration? It isn't. Because sometimes the economy of a country does not explode because of a big war on its territory. It starts to tighten because of a bottleneck. A tiny point on the map, a narrow corridor through which passes enough energy to shake markets, governments, currencies, and the pocket of millions of people who don't even know where this place is. And that's where the story becomes really dangerous. Because the problem is not only having conflict in the Middle East. The problem is what happens when this conflict touches one of the most sensitive points of global trade, the Strait of Hormuz. And there is a part of this story that almost nobody explains properly. Canada, even being far away, is not protected from this. In practice, it may end up paying the bill of a chaos that started thousands of kilometers away. But before getting to the supermarket, to inflation, and to the cost of living, there is a question that needs to be answered. How can such a small piece of sea manage to scare the entire world? The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow passage between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean. It looks like just another maritime route. Except it isn't. It works like a pressure valve of global energy. A gigantic volume of oil and gas passes through there. And when this flow is threatened, the market does not wait for the disaster to happen to react. It reacts before. It reacts to the risk. This detail changes everything. Because the price of energy does not rise only when there is real destruction. It rises when investors, refineries, carriers, and governments begin to believe that there may be interruption. That is, it does not need to close the strait completely for the damage to start. It is enough to make the route uncertain. It is enough an attack on ships. It is enough a fire in critical infrastructure. It is enough the threat of drones, missiles, or naval mines. It is enough for the world to realize that that crossing has become a lottery. And when that happens, the cost of fear enters into the price of everything. This is the first point that many people underestimate. The second is even more unsettling. Protecting a place like this is not simple, nor fast, nor clean. From the outside, it may seem easy. Send warships, escort tankers, and that's it. Problem solved. In real life, it does not work like that. Because there are visible threats, like drones, missiles, and fast boats. But there is also the invisible nightmare, maritime mines. And this is where the scenario becomes much more serious than it seems in the headlines. A mine does not need to sink dozens of ships to cause damage. Sometimes, the simple suspicion that there are mines on the seabed is already enough to slow down or stall traffic. Inspecting, clearing, and ensuring that a passage is safe takes time. A lot of time. And time in this case means delay, risk, higher insurance premium, more expensive freight, and an entire chain of costs rising in cascade. Now think with me. If energy becomes more expensive, transport becomes more expensive. If transport becomes more expensive, food and goods become more expensive. If companies start to operate with higher costs, they pass it on. If families are already tight, any increase becomes a real problem. This is how a strait on the other side of the world enters the kitchen of a Canadian family. But there is more. Because it is not only about the price of oil itself, it is about the instability that it injects into the whole system. Financial markets become nervous, airlines feel it, logistics chains recalculate routes, insurers increase coverage. Companies that depend on energy, fertilizers, plastic, heavy transport or import start to feel the pressure from all sides. And Canada, which already lives with high housing cost, expensive food and wear on the household budget, does not need much to feel this impact. That is where the video becomes uncomfortable. Because many people imagine that Canada, for being an energy producer, would be shielded. As if the reasoning were simple, if the country produces oil, then a global energy crisis should even help. But real life is not a clean spreadsheet. Canada does not live in a bubble. The price of energy is influenced by international markets. The cost of diesel affects trucks. Fuel affects logistics. Gas affects heating and industry. And when the world enters tension mode, it is not only exports that react. Inflation can also gain new momentum. That is, even when it seems that the country wins on one side, the consumer can lose on several others. This is the type of contradiction that squeezes the middle class. And here arises another problem that few people want to face. There is no simple military solution for a crisis like this. This may be the most frustrating part of all, because when a strategic maritime route comes under threat, the automatic reaction is to imagine a strong, organized coalition ready to act. But today's world is not exactly breathing cooperation. Alliances are more fragmented, interests more divided, and the political willingness to enter new conflicts is increasingly smaller. In other words, everyone knows that the route matters, but not everyone wants to pay the price of stabilizing it. And this prolongs uncertainty. And long uncertainty is economic poison. Now Canada enters this story again. If the situation escalates, the question arises: should Canada participate in some international effort to protect navigation? On paper, it seems like a strategic question. In practice, it exposes another uncomfortable reality: limited capacity. Canada can contribute in some naval aspects, especially in escort or support missions. But when the subject enters asymmetric war, mines, hybrid threats, and prolonged operation in a very high-risk environment, the limitations appear quickly. And this matters for a simple reason: countries can suffer the economic effects of a crisis even without having real power to solve it. This is the trap. You do not control the problem. You cannot neutralize the risk alone. But even so, you absorb part of the bill. It is more or less like living in a building where a fire starts on another floor. You do not have access to the central alarm. You do not control the evacuation, but your insurance bill goes up anyway. That is what the Strait of Hormuz represents for countries like Canada. An external shock that nobody invited, but that everyone may end up financing. And here it is worth opening another important loop. The effect does not always come all at once. Sometimes it arrives in layers. First, tension rises. Then, oil rises. Then, freight and insurance costs increase. Then, markets start to recalculate inflation and interest. Then, companies hold back investment. Then, consumers cut spending. And when you realize, you are no longer talking only about energy. You are talking about economic confidence. An economy, in the end, is a lot of confidence. If companies believe that the scenario will worsen, they protect themselves. If consumers believe that everything will rise, they pull back. If governments see risk of persistent inflation, they become more cautious. And this collective behavior helps to transform geopolitical tension into real slowdown. That is why this topic matters so much for Canada. Because the country is already trying to balance weak growth, high cost of living, pressure on housing, and a feeling of economic insecurity. In such a context, any new external shock weighs more than it would in a more comfortable economy. And maybe this is the central point of this whole story. The danger is not only in the strait, the danger is in the fragility of the moment. If life is already expensive, any global spark becomes an accelerator. If family budgets are already at the limit, any extra rise in energy or transport hurts for real. If confidence is already low, any international crisis seems bigger than it is. So no, this is not only about ships, oil, and a distant conflict. It is about the fact that the modern world was built on top of fragile routes, invisible dependencies, and choke points that almost nobody thinks about in day-to-day life, until one of them enters into crisis. And when that happens, the map disappears and the bill appears. That is when a tiny strait starts to decide how much it costs to fill the tank, how much it costs to transport food, how much it costs to keep the house heated, and how much it costs, in the end, simply to live in a country like Canada. This is the most uncomfortable part, because it shows that the cost of living does not depend only on what Ottawa decides. It does not depend only on the central bank. It does not depend only on the real estate market. Sometimes, it depends on a narrow water corridor, surrounded by tension, where one miscalculated threat is enough for the whole world to feel the impact. And this may be the real message here. Canada may be far from the line of fire, but it is not far from the consequences. If this strait continues unstable, the effect may come in waves. First in the markets, then in energy, then in prices. And finally, in the daily life of those who already feel that each month has become harder to close. So next time someone says that a conflict too far away has nothing to do with us, it is worth remembering this. In an interconnected world, geographic distance does not mean economic protection. And sometimes what makes Canada more expensive is not a decision made at home. It is a bottleneck on the other side of the planet. If you like this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because here we connect the big events of the world with what really weighs in the life of the ordinary Canadian.